Hello, welcome back. Today we'll have a change of pace. I would like us to look at an article that appeared on a website called Library Card. The article appeared in my Twitter feed. It had been tweeted by the philosopher Gary Edwards. When I viewed the piece, it soon became apparent why he had taken the trouble to tweet the article. So today I'd like us to amble through the text as the authors provide us with an almost textbook example of SJW and feminist thinking. When we read the article, we find that they trot out every canard in the relevant ideological playbooks. In the About page on their website, the authors describe themselves as, and I quote, "Library Card was started by a couple of folks who cared deeply about social liberation for all, as well as the emancipatory power of reading. While we didn't come to social justice through books, reading helped us make crucial sense of the world around us, why society was organised the way that it was, and how to fight back. We found new ways to understand our lived experiences through reading the words of others." Now, the first term that might be of concern is lived experience. That sounds familiar. We're only into the second paragraph, and already the authors, perhaps unwittingly, allow an ideological term to leak into their introductory text. And I think most of you, even if you had stumbled upon this page without being forewarned, would begin to suspect you are about to be led down a depressingly familiar intellectual rabbit hole. The authors go on to say, "We're a group of people with a range of interests, diverse backgrounds in social justice, and lots of reading hours under our belts. Access our tagging system to zero in on a series of topics, and you'll find highly curated lists tailored to that particular subject matter." Now, like so many on the progressive left, the authors confuse intellectual labour with thinking. Lots and lots of reading hours will benefit an individual little in the absence of critical intellect and an affinity for truth. We can also be confident that when they make the claim that their topic lists are highly curated, that is probably an understatement. The problem with intellectual bubbles is that while a boundary of the bubble might only be molecular thick, even such a fragile skin is sufficient to maintain a toxic environment. So, having introduced our protagonists, let's now turn to the article itself, which is titled Syllabus on Sex and Gender Differences, How to Disprove Sexist Science. The title tells us everything we need to know. If anyone was undecided in relation to whether the authors had committed to any particular ideology, the title of this article would dispel any lingering doubt. They describe themselves as social justice advocates, but their advocacy is of a particular kind, and the expression sexist science has the rank odour of radical feminism. But let's read on, because it's quite a masterpiece of pseudoscience, fake intellectualism, with a liberal seasoning of common nonsense. The article starts, "Everyone's talking about the Google memo, but unfortunately it raises a number of difficult questions that require focused study. In this post, we're going to give you a detailed guide to all the research that speaks against the idea of biological sex differences in men and women. That is a common, sexist, and ultimately false ideological notion that we need to get rid of through rigorous learning and education. Below is our syllabus on sex and gender differences to disprove sexist science." By detailed guide, they mean we will recommend you read a few feminist authors. So now they move on to the biological sex is sexist mantra. Science is sexist, which of course means that biology is sexist. Therefore, biological sex itself is sexist. This is almost textbook feminist theory that could almost be mistaken for parody, but have no doubt about the author's sincerity. Unlike many radical scholars, they seem to believe their own mythology. The interesting part is towards the end of the introductory paragraph, where they say, and I quote, "That is a common, sexist, and ultimately false ideological notion that we need to get rid of through rigorous learning and education." So, it's a settled matter. There is no reflection here. All that is left is to educate, and educate rigorously. This reminds us of another, perhaps less well-defined ideology. An ideology, although not explicitly expressed, lingers at the threshold of perception. We can use the terms used by the authors like an archaeologist would use artifacts, and recreate the author's ideological provenance. And here we detect the unmistakable undercurrent of Marxism, unwittingly expressed in a single sentence. Next, we come to this graphic, helpfully labelled the ideological patriarchal model of gender and sex according to scientism. So now, biology is not just sexist, but it has now morphed into scientism, and biological sex has become an ideological patriarchal model. It might just be me being cynical, but I seem to detect more than a little projection here on the part of the authors. But it's almost as if their reasoning revolves around political slogans at this point. It could hardly be described as subtle. How they avoid becoming self-aware at this point is baffling. But moving on to the graphics themselves. The charts at first glance appear to be some form of infographic, but if you look closely, they are not. They only appear to be. The different size circles seem decorative. There is no correlation between display size and some data set. The colour is simply that, a pretty radial gradient on one and a linear gradient on the other. It does look technical, but if you trouble to read the labels, we soon see a few issues. Let's take the left-hand graphic first. The top label reads biological gender. Apart from the obvious fact that sex is biological, but gender is not, there is another, not so obvious issue. That is, if we assume that their argument is correct and that sex is merely an oppressive patriarchal construction and not biology, why would they believe that gender is biological and not a social construction? It's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? How does one replace one for the other without noticing this obvious paradox? The other, perhaps more practical concern is that they have three categories along the axes, but only two labels are used to identify groups within the graphic itself, cisgender and transgender. Now, I have no idea what a two-spirit is, but what label do we apply to that group along with the intersex group using this kind of representation? The author of the graphic does not supply that information for some reason. Moving on to the second graph, which is more interesting, we find it has lots of labels, but we can simplify it a little by simply using a table that captures all the relevant information presented, and it would look something like this. Even though they've erased biological sex from any consideration, because, after all, that is a patriarchal, sexist model, it needs to be replaced with gender, which for some unstated reason we are to consider as biological. But we are still left with a binary. Only now we have no way to explain the correlation or indeed why humans seem to be such a unique species in this regard. All of these potential issues are left unexplained. We may as well be looking at an astrological chart for all the insight it provides us. The article then goes on to recommend a list of feminist authors whose work confirms their worldview. The two of most interest are Cordelia, whose work includes Testosterone Rex and Delusions of Gender, and Judith Butler, American philosopher and gender theorist. We shall take a brief look at both these feminist scholars. First, Cordelia. Her recent book, Testosterone Rex, has been roundly criticised for its presentation of biology. The biologist Jerry Coyne has dismantled the work in an article titled Testosterone Rex, a biased polemic, wins the Royal Society Book Prize. In one section of the article, he writes, and I quote, "I've written about that in detail before, particularly in the post cited above, when ideology trumps biology. It's in the interests of the regressive left to ignore science that goes against their belief in an everybody's equal hypothesis, for, they think, showing differences in behaviour, preferences, abilities and so on between genders or ethnic groups will supposedly lead to racism and sexism." I will link to the full article in the description box below. We now turn to Judith Butler, an American gender theorist, whose main thesis is that genders are simply performance. She never quite gets round to explaining why children seem to master this performance so quickly, or why bonobos would feel the need to engage in displays of performative gender. But these are minor points. I think the best way to understand Butler's position is to let her explain it herself.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. You know, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim.
So that's the article. I thought it worth going through it because it's relatively short, but it packs in a lot of what is wrong with this type of ideological thinking. The bias is obvious, as is the commitment to a particular type of political position. The authors of this article oppose science, not just biology, because science itself presents an intractable problem for those committed to feminism and social justice, so its denial should come as no surprise. But that is self-defeating because people will accept a scientific fact rather than reject it on ideological grounds. So when they see science itself rejected because of a perceived political bias, they instinctively grasp what's going on. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.